Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa Lancer-Rose. And this is This Animal Life. Anne is away this week, but we have with us a special guest, Steven Shaviro. I'm so excited about today's episode because we're going to talk about a creature that is not like any other creature we've ever discussed. It is a sentient being, but it doesn't have a brain at all. So in that sense, it's mind-blowing. The slime mold is interesting because it's a single-celled amoeba. Yet it can learn, remember, and make decisions. I'll put links in the show notes to loads of videos so you can see slime molds in action. And Steven's thought a lot about it because he's an American academic who does stuff like this. He's a philosopher and a cultural critic. His areas of interest include film theory, science fiction, panpsychism, and subjectivity. He's earned his PhD from Yale, and he teaches at Wayne State University. The book of his that we're going to be talking about will be in the show notes. It's called Discognition, and it has a whole chapter on slime molds. And if this gets you excited, the other chapters will really get you excited. All right, so Steven, I can't remember when we met, but I do know it was at the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts. And all I remember about that night was one of the best conversations I've ever had. Still. It must have been, what, like 5 years ago?
No, it's more, well, the book which has that info came out in 2016, so it was earlier than that, a couple of years ago.
Wow. You just held me in thrall with slime molds for at least 2 hours. I think I was ready to call it a night when we met. I was about to go upstairs and I was hanging on your every word. So what I was wondering is, how did you first discover slime molds?
Well, okay, several things. One is, I'm not a scientist, but I try to read a lot of stuff about science. I'm interested in it. One of my main things I do as a scholar is I'm a scholar of science fiction. And, there are many reasons why science fiction is interesting, but one reason is that science fiction takes actual phenomena and extrapolates from it in various ways. So I try to read about the phenomena and if I read a novel that I like, then I try to educate myself on the phenomenon that it's kind of based on. Of course, one of the things I became interested in was just different time. I like reading science fiction, which tries to imagine other types of thought than human thought. And there are a lot of books which have, intelligent aliens who are very different, or uplifted intelligent animals, which are, raised up to human level intelligence, but which keep their own characteristic, what they actually are as animals. So, but there's other stuff as well, and not just with animals. So at some point I came across, I don't think this was in a book, but I came across slime molds.
Wait, there was no story. You just happened upon.
There is now, but it wasn't. It was after I did all my stuff that somebody wrote a science fiction novel which had slime molds in it.
So you discovered them in science fiction after because you wrote about them in Discognition.
Yes, I think about, I try, obviously they're different, but there's a certain sense in which some scientific discoveries are sufficiently weird enough you can think of them as. So when I book Discognition, most of the chapters are about various science fiction narratives. And then what I did was I took all these scientific surveys about slime molds and treated them the same way I treat a science fiction novel. Look at this kind of weird stuff going on, and it involves cognition and action and doing all these strange things, and a type of mentality different from, baseline human mentality, which is part of what the book was about in general. Right. So but anyway, for that part, I mostly read actual scientific research papers. And I'm a novice, so I don't always understand the math. That's, so I don't completely understand the papers, but I understand enough. Yeah, well, again, I read these scientific papers, and parts of them I don't get, as I said, especially the mathematics, which is really important in any science, including biology, but I get enough to sort of make general sense. And slime molds are these just very weird organisms.
Let's talk about what they are. Are they animals?
No, they're not animals. No, they're completely unique. Okay, so we have three kingdoms of multicellular life, which are animals, plants, and fungi, or funguses, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Which are all very distinctive, and and everything else is usually single-celled, and so plants, animals, and fungi are eukaryotes. But there are a lot of single-celled organisms with, parameciums and amoebas and stuff like that. I mean, there are lots of different types.
I have seen it classified as an amoeba.
Yes. So slime molds, there are actually two types, but I'll talk about one especially.
But they get lumped with fungi.
Well, that's wrong. They get lumped with fungi just because of the word mold, because molds, regular molds, are fungus. But it's words are often used more loosely in common parlance than they are.
Yes.
There's a French biologist, Audrey Dussutour, who wrote a French bestseller. It hasn't been translated in English, but I read it in French, about slime molds, and she just calls it le blob.
Yeah,
like the English blob. So we mean
it is a blob. We should have started with that.
Yeah. So okay, what slime molds are like is that they are a weird in between single-celled organisms and multicellular organisms.
Yeah.
The way they arise is that they basically divide like cells divide. But if you have like an amoeba, when it divides, the cell divides, we have two amoebas with the same
The cell
DNA.
also divides.
Yes. In animals, plants, and funguses, you have sexual reproduction, but even some animals, plants, and funguses reproduce asexually. It's still like a small part of it. A cell buds off and starts a new organism. Mm-hmm. So slime molds are the weird thing in between these two, which is that they do the cells do divide. The cell nuclei do divide, which usually means two cells, but they don't split apart. So so an amoeba, when the nucleus divides, becomes two amoebas. The slime mold, when the nucleus divides, stays one blob of protoplasm with multiple nuclei in it. So when you get a slime mold which is big enough to see in person, which is like 3 inches long or 6 inches long.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said that, because as I've studied all this stuff and I've watched all these videos, it was so hard to believe that was one cell I was looking at.
Yeah, well, that's the point. It has actually millions of nuclei, but it's not millions of cells. It stays the same cell.
No, it's just a massive cell that can spread out.
With multiple nucleuses is one. Well, I'm actually sorry. I used to see them. I live in Detroit and I live in an urban area, but on my campus where I teach, there used to be a spot where there were slime molds like all summer. So like I see new ones every day. But they did some construction, built a new building on top of that space, and so I don't see the slime molds anymore.
Oh, have you ever had your own pet slime mold?
No, the people are doing that. I mean, that's the deal recently. I haven't actually done.
I will put a link in the show notes to how you can adopt a slime mold.
They're doing lots of things. I mean, this French scientist has slime molds sent up on the space shuttle to see how they react to no gravity.
See, the thing is that just as they captured your imagination as qualifying as the brainchild of some science fiction genius, they have captured the imagination of musicians and robotics engineers, artists.
So the thing about slime molds is that though they're just this blob of protoplasm, they're a single cell, which also means they don't have separate organs. Like in multicellular beings, you have, as I said before, different cell types, so that some's the stem of the plant, some's the leaves, some's the flowers, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. The slime stays to be the same, the same thing. It doesn't have different organs, and yet it moves around and makes decisions. One way it's not like a fungus is that it moves around. It's not tied to the earth the way both plants and fungi are.
Which we could only know because of time-lapse photography.
Yeah, it moves around and as it's looking for food. And so it's this blob which spreads along the ground, usually in damp, shaded areas. Like most people find them in forests. As I said, there used to be this one spot in my campus where they just were flourishing, but it's not there anymore.
And you could easily mistake it for a lichen or a mold. It looks multicellular because
it depends. I mean, I'm sure there's some which people do. I mean, there's only one species which is very commonly found, which I could find on my campus. And that one species, its colloquial name is dog vomit.
I was going to say, is it the dog vomit?
But it's yellow, so it's a striking color, different from any plants or mushrooms or whatever. And it's sort of splayed along the ground. If you go back and come back 2 hours later, has slightly different vegetation because it's been moving, though it just moves really slow.
That's how you'll know it's been moving, is if you come back and check.
After a while, I mean, so I don't know. The thing is, they do have a life cycle with sexual as well as asexual reproduction.
I guess what I have come across is, well, in your essay in particular, begins with what is it like to be a slime mold?
Yeah. Think like.
Yeah. So the part where it makes decisions or learns, there's evidence that it learns.
What's really interesting to scientists and they've only really discovered this in the last 15 years or so, is that these organisms think and make decisions. And what do they think about? They want food, they're hungry. There's some substances they have aversions to and stay away from. They like to check out. The reason they sprawl, if they're in a location and they don't have food, they just sprawl, they extend pseudopods, extend little parts of their blobness in all directions to look for food. If one part of it finds the food, the rest of it starts flowing towards the food source, and so on and so forth. So it has active seeking behavior to find food, and it has certain aversions to certain things which hurt it.
Okay.
And so scientists started doing experiments with this and found that there's definitely a cognitive skill involved. In other words, what this means, I mean, it's sort of like, how do you know what this means thinking or not? Sometimes we think that only, only more advanced animals think.
Or animals with neurons, for example.
Yeah. Well, some philosophers, Descartes, the philosopher Descartes, believed that all animals were automatons, only humans had souls. And he actually had a dog, I found out. And yet, I don't understand how anybody could have a dog and not think the dog is obviously thinking and feeling and doing all these things.
That's a great question.
But anyway, even at his time, other people disagreed with him. Leibniz, next great philosopher a century later, said, of course, animals have souls. They don't have human souls, but they have their own kind of souls. But anyway, the point is, it's rare to think of that beyond animals. But if you define intelligence or cognition or mentality in terms of being able to, the basic biological way to think about it, I think, is something has a certain degree of, it's complicated, we can come back to that. Mm-hmm. It has intelligence if it responds flexibly to outside stimuli. It can survey the world actively. In other words, we don't just, the old psychology was stimulus response, but in fact, scientists today, biologists today say it's not, it's really the reverse. Almost all organisms engage in reality testing. They don't just respond to stimuli, but it seems that all animals with neurons do this, but actually it seems that all living things do this.
So this single cellular animal, an amoeba with the multiple nuclei, is testing its environment, which means it has an expectation. Can you give me an example of the slime mold?
Well, again, one of the experiments they've done, which has been really successful, so they've had slime molds solve mazes.
Okay. Yeah, you see a lot of this. It's fun to watch.
You put the slime mold at one end of the maze and you put a food source at the other end of the maze, and there are lots of dead ends. And basically, what the slime mold does is it systematically explores the maze. If it reaches a dead end and there's no food, it just withdraws. But when it reaches, if it finds food, then it sends more of itself in that direction.
And it doesn't go back. It doesn't go back to the dead ends.
Marking, leaves a mark when it goes to dead end. It leaves a marking so it knows that that's been already tested. So when they do this test with slime molds, it turns the slime molds solve the maze. In other words, you come back a day later and the slime molds gotten either the most effective or the only route from beginning to end, which actually gets through the maze and comes out the other side. Actually, there are trade-offs. I read one wild article which basically said that the psychology of slime molds is very similar to the psychology of human beings who are going shopping.
I think that was in Discognition. Yes, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like if you have two alternatives, One is better but more dangerous. Like one food is really nourishing, but it's a little dangerous to get it. The other food is not as much nourishing, but it's much safer to go after. Which one do you choose? You're weighing these things against each other, and the slime molds would sometimes do one under the other, but they could did multiple trials and did it statistically, and they found the math was the same as the kind of heuristics by which, again, without being conscious of the math, but human beings decide. Sometimes you might go for one, sometimes you might go for the other. It will depend on circumstances, depending on how you calculate, even though you do this subconsciously,
Yes,
without necessarily.
The quick and dirty decision. It's not necessarily the most rational decision.
Yeah, so it seems the slime molds make these kinds of decisions also, and that the mathematics even comes out very similarly.
Wow. There's much is made of the map of Tokyo.
Yeah, and then, well, they also did experiments where they did they put food, they did the map of the Tokyo, I think they also did the London subway system, and they put bits of food at places correspond to all the stops, and the slime mold would follow the best routes, and so it actually replicated the subway map because it figured out the best routes between each of the different nodes, so it could get all the food sources.
Sometimes I wonder, how is that, when it finds the path of least resistance, how is that different from water running down a mountainside and finding the stream?
Well, again, what I was saying before is it's about being totally mechanistic. I mean, water, if the circumstances would always do the same thing.
Okay.
Where with any living thing, it seems there's more variability. In other words, I mean, sometimes decisions are very clear, and one would be so stupid that you always make the other one. But often there's doubt, or there are different factors to weigh. Like I was saying, one which is richer in food, in nutrition, but more risky to get to. And so the point is, this seems to be true for all living things, even bacteria, who sense gradients of sugars in the water and swim towards it. It seems that all living things, to at least a certain extent, are capable of making flexible decisions, meaning that you don't necessarily have, if the same circumstances lead to the exact same result. I mean, it's sort of like, a non-living thing, basically, it's not flexible. It'll always do the same thing in the same circumstances.
Okay. So that variability, which would vary moment to moment, circumstance to circumstance, amoeba to amoeba.
That's what it means to say that it's making decisions.
Okay.
Now, again, those decisions statistically add up. But I mean, if you look at human decisions of people going shopping, for instance, those statistically add up either also. Right. So there is a regularity we can observe if you look at multiple trials, but there's a certain degree of flexibility in the organism's response. And as I said, this doesn't seem to be only true for animals or organisms that have complex brains. It's true, it seems to be true for all living things, including all the ones that don't have brains.
Now, I was wondering, how are they thinking?
Well, we don't really know, but I mean, one way to say it is, do we really know how we're thinking? Some philosophers seem to think that we only think in language, and if you don't have language, you don't thought, and that seems to me to be clearly wrong from just observation of, say, dogs and cats. They are clearly thinking, they're looking at alternatives, they're making decisions. Do that.
The slime mold, when you look under a microscope, you can see that it has vesicles. Is that what they are? I don't know. They're like veins, the equivalent of veins. They're pathways.
Basically, yeah. I mean, it's all one big blob of protoplasm with no cellular division, but there are different internal differentiations.
Right. And liquid or substances it oscillates, and it's like the blood goes back and forth.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, we're all made out of protoplasm ultimately, which is, though it's modified in us and in other, but the protoplasm just vibrates and oscillates, and different chemical concentrations stream through it, and that presumably has something. When it finds a food source, it sends, the message propagates through the entire organism. That's why the organism starts moving more of itself towards where the food is found.
So that's the attractant behavior. And then if there's too much light or a puff of cold air, that's the experiment that showed it learned. Yeah,
because there's certain things it has an aversion to, but just like they teach rats, on one hand, they can condition a rat to not do something which it needs because it was connected with electric shock, let's say. And then even without the shock, it won't do the thing, but they had a thing where slime molds don't like salt. So they put salt in the way between the slime mold and the food, and eventually the slime mold learned to overcome its aversion to salt in order to get to the food.
Your writing is so clear, and it so well anticipates any question that I have.
Thank you.
So I would something would arise to me, something would occur, and then you would answer it within the next paragraph. It was very graceful, but I still came across other people talking about, in particular, Physarum polycephalum. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
I've just read it, that it actively feels and thinks.
Well, again, I think I would agree with that, but we don't know. I mean, part of the problem is we don't really know what feeling and thinking mean.
Okay.
I don't know. This is actually something, I mean, I can talk about this now because it's actually something, I mean, a lot of the time they just talk about cognition.
Mm-hmm.
But I think cognition per se is too narrow, and
okay.
It's like, think about dogs. There's certain things, I mean, my dog, and I think it's true of dogs in general, is a genius at figuring out my emotional state, and at figuring out things like whether I'm about to go out the door or not, and things like that.
Yeah.
No, dogs are not geniuses at things like if their leash gets all tangled up, they don't know, they can't figure out how to untangle it.
Well, Mick can, but okay.
I'm glad for you. I'm glad, that's great, but a lot of dogs can't. And I think part of the point is that there are different types of mental activities. And we tend, because we're analytic and scientific creatures, we tend to overestimate certain types of narrowly cognitive accomplishments, like being able to detangle the thing, and underappreciate certain things, which are also, you call them cognitive, but they're also more emotion-based than
glad you said that. Yes, absolutely.
Able to feel and sense certain things, which might themselves be vague. I mean, I can't always even explain what my own mood is at certain times. I mean, I try to express myself, but it's often, you often feel like you can't quite say what it is that you're actually feeling. Mm-hmm. And, but so dogs don't say in the linguistic terms that we use, but they understand a lot of things having to do with feelings, and things which are intrinsically a little bit vague and not as linear and spelled out step by step as what we think of as cognition. But that, I mean, people call things like emotional intelligence and other things. I don't know, I don't have a good theory. I don't know there's a single good theory explaining what all this stuff is, but there's a lot.
You talked about
there's a lot of
electric shock creating an aversion, and a creature will learn to leave alone the thing that it needs because of pain. I think maybe humans have had a similar training and an inhibition of their behavior when it comes to anthropomorphism. That probably the term itself is the wrong word or the wrong etymology. And so when we attribute emotional or intellectual, even ethical reasoning or reactions, we shrink away from that.
I think there are a lot of things like this. We have the right intuitions, but we're not quite saying them right.
Right. And it has inhibited our understanding and appreciation of other creatures.
That's true even of ourselves, but it's more true for things that aren't the same as ourselves. Even when, we have a very close relation with dogs, and that's much closer than our relation with other mammals, just in terms of thousands of years of co-history. But again, it's sort of like, it's wrong to say the dog has the same kind of feel. My dog has the same kind of feelings that I have, but it's also wrong to say my dog, it doesn't have strong emotions and feelings either. And it's we don't have good words for that part because it's very hard to get the right words for that.
Yeah, we need to work on that. There was a scene in the documentary about slime molds. I think it's called The Creeping Garden, which implies that the slime mold is a plant. But anyway, I guess there are all kinds of things in a garden. So and in The Creeping Garden, a man is showing a time-lapse video of a slime mold. There are lots of those, of course, in the video. And even some of the history of film and how that contributed to our insights into slime mold. So this slime mold is in a limited environment, and it has plenty to eat, plenty of moisture. And he says the slime mold is happy. And it's growing and it's eating and it's thriving. And then it becomes aware that its resources have run out. And he says it begins to panic. And he shows you that this is the slime mold panicking. It's trying, and he says it needs to make a decision, and it has two choices. It can go dormant, or it can reproduce I forget.
Yeah.
Yes. And he says now the slime mold is making its decision. Now it has decided and it stops panicking because the decision has been made. I think it goes dormant. That's the choice it's made.
Well, as I said, I think that in different ways, I mean, there's always the danger of making it sound too similar to us, but there's also the danger of making it be too dissimilar to us. I mean, as I said, I think again, it's like in plant, when they talk about plants, there's some botanists who talk about plant neurobiology by analogy, but literally plants don't have neurons. So there are other scientists who say that's not the right term. So, I mean, how can again, it will never have the absolutely right term. Some of these things are just.
These are our frames of reference. This is how we feel when our resources are limited. We panic. And
Yes,
in the
literature, but that's what literature and art are for also. It's stuff that can't be said in the precise scientific terms, but nonetheless has a certain truth to it.
Yeah.
You can say it metaphorically or indirectly. And that's,
The slime mold was agitated. As its resources depleted, it became agitated.
Right. And then it made a decision of what to do about it, which is, again, philosophers who've talked about this have said, I mean, there was one philosopher, David Chalmers, who's one of the best known philosophers talking about intelligence. And he suggested maybe in a very minimal way, a thermostat has mentality.
Okay.
But it has this binary choice, on or off. But the difference is the thermostat will always make the same, there's a threshold temperature and at which it turns on. If it's heating, then it's above that temperature, it just won't turn on. If it goes below the certain temperature, then it turns on until it reaches temperature. So in a certain sense, the thermostat makes a decision, but the difference between the thermostat and something that's alive is that there's no flexibility in the thermostat's decision.
Is it flexibility, or is it our limited understanding of what went into that creature's decision? Like if we knew more.
But again, do we know always why we make our own decisions? I don't think so. I mean, there's always a question of levels and of degrees, Okay. So we cannot operate without making abstractions. And yet we also know on some level that every abstraction is a falsification because it's leaving stuff out.
Yeah. Would you say that the abstraction in the word sentience can safely be applied to the slime mold?
I think so. Okay. This is another thing I thought I don't have an answer with. I do believe the slime mold is sentient. Now, the trouble is that these words have vague definitions, which they have to by because we don't know everything exactly. But there's something. I mean, there's some philosophers who distinguish between sentience, which they admit living things have in general, and sapience or wisdom, which they think only human beings have, or only entities that use language have. And I strongly dislike this because it leads to a very human-centered thing, which I think is unjust. It doesn't give proper recognition to, say, that animals feel and suffer and enjoy and things like that.
Why is that something you feel strongly about?
Well, I don't know. It just seems, two things. One, it just seems obvious to me that it seems obvious to me that my dog and my cats have feelings and ideas and things like that, even though they can't speak English. Secondly, part of the reason for our crisis today is that we're destroying the environment which we ourselves depend on because we kind of too easily just thought everything else is like inferior and we can do whatever we want to it. Now, again, ultimately, you might apply this to non-living things as well. You're concerned about all the animals, plants, and fungi live in the river, but you're also concerned with the river itself, you might say. But the point is that if we're too human-centered, which is too easy to think that we have, there are obviously certain things we do which other things don't do, like being able to talk in complex sentences. Animals and plants and all entities communicate, but they don't communicate. There's an extra level of communication, of complexity in communication, which spoken and written language only human beings have, which other things don't. But it's things get really messed up if you just too easily make that complacent and say, okay, they don't speak, they don't really think the way we do, they have much more primitive forms of thinking, and therefore we can take no account of them. And, partly having that arrogant attitude is why we're destroying the world. I mean, I don't know that much about, indigenous peoples around the world, but I mean, one of the things that's said about them is that they often have a much better sense of living with other entities in their environment. They don't go out and destroy square miles of rainforest in order to grow crops which will give them a big profit next year. They realize that we have to live with these other things. We kill some other things and eat them, but nonetheless, we're living in an ecological, they don't have. So, I mean, this is not the same as science of ecology in the world today,
No.
but it's definitely a sensitivity about the world, about other entities in the world, which we need, and which other people in other societies at other times have had. So, so I think it's important for us today to get away from excessive anthropocentrism.
Or to bring other creatures into our moral regard.
Yeah.
It seems as if discovering that another creature has intelligence or sentience somehow elevates it, that we have more regard for something for a crow, once we discover that it can solve a problem or make a tool.
That's why I was saying before that not all mentality is cognition. There are other things going on. And sometimes we call it a form of cognition, like emotional intelligence. But I like sentience, which you used earlier, but I think sentience is a good word. I think about decisions is a good word. I think all living things very clearly make decisions, meaning that they have a choice and that there's some flexibility. Doesn't mean they have an absolute rational basis for the choice. I mean, we human beings do. We have to make decisions when we don't have any.
We probably aren't as rational as we think we are. We find a reason for a decision later.
Emotions can be dangerous, but they're also very necessary and important.
Expedient.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can't do without them. Thinking about this, but on the other hand, if you don't have emotional reactions, you cannot decide anything at all.
So why do slime molds matter? Why do you think people are so fascinated with them, first of all? And then second of all, why should we care?
On this one level, we say, oh, look how cool this is. Isn't this weird?
It is cool.
It's really cool.
The slime mold has been very clever in that we are propagating it because we have so much fun with it.
Yes.
Now they're sending it in the mail all over the world, if you want a slime mold.
That's true of a lot of,
orchids, dog breeds.
Yes, I mean, they're the number of dogs versus the number of wolves in the world today.
Mm-hmm. This is Michael Pollan. Yeah.
Astronomically more, many orders of magnitude more dogs than wolves.
Yeah. The botany of desire. He talks about that.
So yeah. Well, so when some of the wolves decided to cozy up to humans and become dogs, they didn't know what would happen, but in fact, it was a successful strategy for them.
It was brilliant. So and we kill wolves. Well, I guess we kill dogs too, but we propagate them more than we can. Yeah. So now we're propagating at least a few kinds of the 900 different species of slime molds. We have a few favorites, we humans.
Well, the reason there are a few favorites is because there's so much easier to experiment with.
Yeah, what is it about Physarum polycephalum that makes it so popular?
It's not only that they do well in an experimental situation, which others might do also, they don't know, but also once they have established them, there are companies which breed them and send them out.
I can tell you, I would, as a kid, I would rather have a Physarum polycephalum than a sea monkey.
Yeah, I think they're more interesting.
There was a man that has his grand piano hooked up to a slime mold. And it's playing they're playing a duet. He's got it hooked up. There was a robotics professor, this is again in that documentary, who has a slime mold driving a little robotic car. Now, what I wanted to know is, does the slime mold in any way steer with purpose? Is it going, does it have a motive? Is it going somewhere?
It depends on the levels of translation. So certain things the slime mold is doing get translated into motions of the car or into sound.
Yeah, but it's incidental.
Yes, that might be incidental. That's why I'm not sure. I did read about an experiment where they taught rats, to drive little cars, and the rats love driving the cars. It's like,
yeah, and you can give a rat someplace to go. It's making me think of what's it called? Live Wired, David Eagleman's book about neuroplasticity. And how, and you talk about this in Discognition many times, but in the slime mold chapter, you talk about the slime mold's method of memory, that it's externalized, just as we put phone numbers now, instead of memorizing, we put them in a cell phone. That's how the slime mold knows, don't go down that dead end. When it
goes someplace and withdraws, it leaves.
Yeah, it's like left a Post-it for itself there. Been there, done that, nothing there.
So if you erase the chemical trail, then the slime will explore it again because we won't know.
That's so cool.
No, it seems just mean to trick, entity that way. But that's one way.
Like cutting off the cat, with the whiskers off a cat and chasing it at a picket fence, and it thinks it can go through. That's so mean.
Yeah.
So this man with the piano, he's hoping that the slime mold begins to react to the tones that he plays, and then having a collaboration. So slime molds inspire us to ask all kinds of questions, right? But one of the ones I'm wondering about is, does it in any way stimulate your sense of awe or wonder or reverence for life or
Well, sure. I mean, the point is, it's just amazing how many. The trouble is, this all includes things which are noxious and destroy and hurt us, like COVID viruses and things like that. But all life forms, or even semi-life forms, since it's a virus a life form or not, it's hard to decide. But all biological entities have amazing things about them, even if there are some cases where, like the COVID virus or the malaria bacterium, which we want to exterminate because they're so harmful to us.
Does it make you think, or does it seem to provide evidence for the notion that there is something like sentience or consciousness in all things?
That's something I'm really interested in, but it's a difficult question. I don't know how to answer it. So there's some philosophers today, as well as throughout history of Western philosophy, who believed in what's now called panpsychism.
Can you define that for us?
Panpsychism is the argument that basically some kind of proto-mentality is a property of everything physical, of everything material, of everything in the world. So it's not that mind is separate from body and they're two separate things, which is an older theory, which has been very common. There's really serious problems with it to explain things. But what this is saying is that, like, an electron or a quark inside a proton has some kind of we're not saying it has thoughts or speaks language, but it has some kind of proto-sentience. It's experiential in a certain way. And that it's because that exists as a basic property of all matter that then living things which organize matter in very particular ways accentuate this.
Okay.
That living things seem to be much more flexible in their interaction with their environment than non-living things. We don't think of other living things, let alone non-living things, as having they're just material which we can just shape, or totally passive shape any way we want. It's saying that mentality is just another property of matter.
Does that spoil it for you to think that is something missing then?
No, it doesn't spoil it for me. It doesn't. It spoils it for me when, there was a famous philosopher, I think he's still alive, Thomas Nagel, who wrote an article called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And his point was that it's like something to be a bat. Bats have experiences. They're mammals. They're warm-blooded mammals. They have experiences. They fly around. They sense their environment. They eat food, and they have sex. They do all these things. So it must be like something to be a bat. But it's very hard for us to imagine what it's like to be a bat, because bats have very poor eyesight and they get everything through hearing. Now, sometimes human beings develop their hearing better if they're blind and they can, echolocate. But nonetheless, there's no way that human beings have the same kind of experience, sound-centered world instead of a sight-centered world, the way bats do. So he was saying, we know that it's like something to be a bat, but we can't quite say what it is. One of the ways I talk about mentality is say, if it means what is it like to be something? Maybe like something to be a slime mold. Is it like something to be a rock? I think that all living things engage, as I said this before, engage in kind of reality testing.
Yeah. What does it value?
Yeah. So I think all living things value certain things and disvalue certain other things. Likes and dislikes are very different from ours.
So a slime mold, could it love another slime mold, or does it love itself?
Well, again, I don't think it does in the sense that we think of it, because because the whole point is that requires, a sense of yourself as a kind of cut off entity.
It does recognize itself, maybe not in a mirror, but what's your takeaway for slime molds?
I'm not sure I have a single takeaway, except understanding how sentience is widely distributed among living things. There's a British science fiction writer named Adrian Tchaikovsky. And he's written a lot of things, but he's written 2 books which actually reflect on this. So the first book is called Children of Time, and it's about a planet where, basically various things go wrong, and they have a genetic thing which can increase intelligence of organisms. And they seed a planet with various forms of Earth life, but they never get to the humans or the primates. And so this so this kind of artificial, virus or whatever, which increases intelligence, gets imbibed among the spiders. So eventually you get a society of spiders who are as intelligent as human beings are. And he tries to write it about where he think about why would we be different, because spiders are coming from a very different background set of, coordinates. And it's a great book. And then he wrote a sequel called Children of Ruin, where the same thing happens with octopuses. A scientist really
I have read the spider book, but I would be interested in the octopus book too. It was an unforgettable experience.
Yes, I know. And but in the octopus book, the second book, Children of Ruin, he also has a life form which hasn't been promoted by humans, but it turns out on one of these plants there was a kind of slime mold-like organism which assimilates everything to itself, and they eventually have to convince it not to assimilate everything to itself, because then basically the slime mold-like organism, basically any other entity, any other life form it can colonize, it basically turns into more of itself. And this can be a horrific thing for the other, for the humans, octopuses, the other intelligent organisms. But they eventually are able to convince it that it's losing its avid for new experiences, new lifestyles, new information. But by turning everything into more of itself, it sort of suppresses that. And so they finally convince it, they rationally convince it to behave differently and to not just turn everything else encounters into more of itself, because its own experiences will be richer that way, which is what it basically wants, to enrich in its own experiences.
All right.
If you liked that, which is Children of Time, then you should read the sequel, which is Children of Ruin.
Steven, thank you so much for talking with me. It's been a lot of fun. It always is. You're a joy to speak with.
Well, thanks for that, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's fun to talk about stuff like this and to have a great interlocutor to talk about them with. So pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven.
Bye.
Bye. If you like this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and tell your friends about it and all. Click like and leave a review. That helps us a lot, actually. Special thanks to Chip Salerno for this music that I love. Thanks to Sarah K. Martin, our graphic designer, who does these very clever little illustrations for us and makes us look so professional. I adore them. We'd love to know what you like about the podcast and anything we got wrong. I'd love to know, because I'm curious and I want to learn more. So let us know and be nice about it, because then I might actually listen to you. If you have a suggestion for the podcast, we would love to hear it. We have lots of our own ideas, but we aim to please. So if there's something you want, please let us know. We're doing this for you, you clever beast.